They murdered their own gods. After 30 centuries of divine protection, the people of Egypt didn't just lose an empire, they systematically erased their own soul, brick by brick, until the most powerful civilization on earth became a ghost in its own land. For 3,000 years, the gods were not distant myths or symbols. They were roommates. They walked the streets, felt the heat of the sun, and dictated the rhythm of the river. Then, in a historical heartbeat, they were evicted. Their temples were stripped, their sacred statues were toppled, and the names of the eternal were chiseled into oblivion. This was not the result of a single war or a natural disaster. It was a cold, systematic unraveling. A civilization that had mastered the art of immortality simply stopped believing in its own story. The most powerful empire the world had ever known didn't just fall. It was erased from the inside out. To understand the weight of this collapse, one must look at the Nile not as a river of water, but as a lifeline of faith that suddenly began to fray. For 30 centuries, the stability of Egypt was built on a singular, terrifying promise. If the people served the gods would maintain the balance of the universe. This was Ma'at, the divine order that kept the sun rising and the crops growing. At the center of this cosmic machine was the Pharaoh, a being who was not merely a king, but a living bridge between the earth and the heavens. When the Pharaoh spoke, it was believed the gods listened. When the Pharaoh breathed, the nation lived. But somewhere in the shadows of the late dynasties, that ancient glue began to lose its grip. The bridge started to crack, and the water beneath it turned cold. The first fractures didn't come from foreign invaders with swords and chariots, but from the silence of the earth itself. When the floods failed and the harvest withered, the questions grew louder in the streets and the courts. If the Pharaoh was a god, why was the land starving? Why were the granaries empty while the rituals were still being performed with perfection? This was the true beginning of the end, a crisis of faith that moved through the corridors of power like a cold draft. The divine king was no longer seen as invincible, and once the illusion of divinity was shattered, the foundation of the entire reality began to crumble. The people who had once looked to the stars for guidance began to look at the ground in despair, seeing only dust where there should have been life. As this internal order eroded, the vultures of the ancient world sensed the scent of decay. The era of the great warrior pharaohs had passed into the realm of myth, replaced by a succession of leaders more concerned with surviving the next palace coup than guarding the borders. The kingdom split, with rival factions claiming the throne from the Delta to the Upper Nile. Brother fought brother in a cycle of civil strife that drained the wealth of the temples and the morale of the population. This vacuum of power did not remain empty for long. The gates of the empire were left unguarded, and the outsiders were already waiting at the threshold, ready to dismantle what was left of the old world. The shadows were lengthening, and the gods seemed to be packing their bags. The first major shock to the system came from the east. The Persians arrived with an intensity that the Egyptians were fundamentally unprepared for. They did not just want to rule the land, they sought to humiliate its culture. Historical accounts whisper of sacred symbols being desecrated and traditional rituals being openly mocked by the conquerors. For a society that believed their very survival depended on the precision of these rituals, this was more than a military defeat. It was a cosmic catastrophe. The people looked to their gods for a sign, for a miracle that would sweep the invaders back into the desert, but the sky remained terrifyingly silent. This silence suggested something far worse than defeat. It suggested that perhaps the gods had grown bored, or worse, that they had simply abandoned their posts, leaving the mortals to face the darkness alone. Then came the Greeks, led by a man who understood the psychology of power better than any before him. Alexander the Great was greeted not as an invader, but as a liberator, primarily because he was not Persian. Alexander performed a masterstroke of political theater by traveling to the remote Siwa oasis to be declared the son of Amun. He gave the people a pharaoh again, even if he didn't speak their language or share their blood. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed attempted a desperate blend of two worlds, creating a hybrid culture where Greek philosophy met Egyptian mysticism. They built the Great Library and the Lighthouse of Alexandria, turning the city into the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. Yet beneath the surface of this glittering new era, the original Egyptian heart was beating slower. The old ways were being pushed to the margins, becoming a curiosity for scholars rather than a living faith for the masses. The final act of this tragedy was orchestrated by the rising shadow of Rome. The relationship between the last of the Ptolemies and the Roman generals was a desperate dance of survival played out on a global stage. Cleopatra VII, often misunderstood as a figure of mere romance, was in reality a desperate politician trying to keep the pulse of her nation going against an unstoppable machine. Rome did not want Egypt as an ally or even a client state. They wanted it as a resource. They needed the Nile's harvest to feed the restless mobs of Rome and the legions guarding the frontiers. To the Romans, Egypt was not a land of mystery or ancient wisdom. It was a farm. It was a ledger entry in a distant office, a source of grain to be extracted until there was nothing left but husks. When the Roman ships finally secured the harbor of Alexandria, the 3,000-year experiment of the Pharaohs reached its cold, bureaucratic conclusion. The end was not marked by a grand battle that leveled the pyramids, but by a series of administrative decrees. Egypt was downgraded to the personal property of the Roman emperor, a man in Italy who would likely never even step foot on the banks of the Nile. The priests, once the most powerful intermediaries in the world, were replaced by Roman tax collectors who cared nothing for the balance of the universe. The sacred language, the complex and beautiful system of hieroglyphs believed to hold the power of creation, began to die out as the administration shifted to Greek and Latin. The magic was being replaced by math. The most chilling aspect of this fall was the disappearance of the Egyptian soul. As the centuries of Roman rule wore on, the ancient temples were either closed or converted into something unrecognizable. The statues of the gods, once believed to house the actual essence of the divine, were pulled down or simply left to be swallowed by the dunes. The knowledge of how to read the walls of the great monuments was lost, turning the stories of 1,000 generations into silent, meaningless pictures. It was as if a curtain had been drawn across a window that had looked out onto the infinite. The people living in the shadow of the pyramids began to forget who had built them, or more importantly, why they had been built in the first place. The connection to the ancestors was severed, leaving a generation of orphans in a land of giants. There is a theory that civilizations do not die from external pressure alone, but from a profound loss of meaning. Ancient Egypt survived for 3 millennia because it had a story that everyone believed in. They believed that their lives had a place in a divine cycle, that their work mattered to the balance of the universe, and that death was merely a transition to a more beautiful reality. When the civil wars broke that trust, and the foreign invasions proved the pharaohs were only mortal, that story began to fall apart. By the time the Romans arrived, the Egyptians had already lost their identity. They were a people waiting for a new story to tell them who they were because the old gods were no longer providing the answers. They were a vessel that had been emptied long before it was broken. The transition from a dominant global superpower to a provincial backwater is a warning that echoes through the ages. It reminds us that no empire is too large to fail, and no faith is too ancient to be forgotten. The fall of Egypt was not just about the loss of land or gold. It was the extinction of a unique perspective on the universe. When the last priest of Isis passed away and the last person who could read the sacred script died, a whole way of understanding existence blinked out of existence. We are left today with the stone skeletons of their ambition, massive structures that defy the ages but remain stubbornly mute. They stand as monuments to a conversation that no one knows how to resume. We look at the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid and wonder what secrets they still hold. But perhaps the greatest secret is how easily it all slipped away. The decline was marked by a gradual numbing of the public spirit. As the government became more corrupt and the economy more focused on serving a distant master, the average citizen moved from being a participant in a grand divine plan to being a mere survivor. The art became less refined, the architecture less ambitious, and the collective memory of their ancestors' achievements began to fade into myth and superstition. The grand narrative of Ma'at was replaced by the cold pragmatism of survival. The heights of human achievement were traded for the safety of the status quo. What remains is the mystery of the silence. We have the lists of kings, the records of battles, and the tallies of grain, but we don't have the internal thoughts of the people who watch their world end. We can only imagine the feeling of standing in a temple that had been active for 2,000 years and realizing that no one was coming to light the incense anymore. The gods did not die because they were defeated in battle. They died because they were no longer needed in the new world order. The Roman world was one of legal codes and military logistics, leaving no room for the magical, cyclical world of the Nile. It was the death of wonder at the hands of efficiency. The collapse serves as a dark mirror for any civilization that believes itself to be permanent. It shows that the end doesn't always come with a catastrophic explosion. Sometimes it is a slow rot from within, a series of small compromises, and a gradual loss of faith in the things that once made a people great. Egypt was not conquered by Rome so much as it was already hollowed out by the time Rome arrived. The husk was still there, beautiful and imposing, but the life force, the belief in the divine order, had long since evaporated into the desert heat. The pyramids were no longer stairways to the stars. They were just piles of rock in a hungry land. The legacy of Egypt's fall is found in the fragmented records and the silent statues that stare out over the modern landscape. It is a story of what happens when a culture stops looking at the stars and starts looking only at the ground. It is the story of how a civilization that mastered the art of immortality eventually succumbed to the very human flaws of greed, division, and apathy. As the sun sets over the Nile today, it illuminates the same river that saw the rise of the first dynasty and the fall of the last. The water continues to flow, indifferent to the empires that rise and fall along its banks. A constant reminder that while the gods may fall and the kings may die, the world moves on, leaving only the ghosts of greatness to haunt the silence of the desert. If the most stable, most enduring empire in human history could vanish so completely that its very language was forgotten for 1,000 years, what does that say about our own permanence? We live in an age of digital monuments and global systems, yet we are just as susceptible to the fraying of the social fabric. The fall of the gods was not an event. It was a process of forgetting. And in the silence of the shifting sands, a terrifying question remains. If we stopped believing in our own story today, how long would it take for our temples to turn to dust and our names to be chiseled into the void? The desert is patient. It has seen the end of the world before. The final tragedy of Egypt is not that it ended, but that it ended in silence. No one was left to mourn the passing of the old ways because no one remembered what they were. The last hieroglyph was carved by a hand that likely didn't understand the full depth of the power it was wielding. The last prayer was whispered to an empty room. The lights went out one by one across the Nile Valley, not because of a storm, but because no one was left to tend the flame. We walk through the ruins today and feel a sense of awe, but it is the awe of a traveler looking at a machine they don't know how to turn on. The power is still there, trapped in the stone, but the key has been buried by the wind. The gods of Egypt did not die in a war of the heavens. They were starved to death by the indifference of their children. They were buried under the weight of taxes, bureaucracy, and the loss of the human imagination. As we look at the remnants of their world, we shouldn't just see history. We should see a reflection. We should see the fragility of the stories we tell ourselves to keep the darkness at bay. For when the story ends, the civilization ends with it. And all that is left is the wind, the sand, and the terrifying silence of a world that has forgotten how to speak to its creators. In the end, even the eternal can be erased if we simply stop looking up.